Rain came down on Millbrook in sheets the morning Iris Latham arrived, and it came down hardest on the schoolhouse steps, where 3 churchwardens stood under a single dripping umbrella and refused to hand her the key. "We are expecting Mr. I. Latham," said the eldest of them, a stout man named Corbett, who smelled of wet wool and older mutton, holding the iron key against his chest as though she might snatch it. Not a young person, not a— He gestured at her, at the rain flattening her bonnet, at the small trunk the coachman had already dumped in the mud and driven off from, eager to be quit of Millbrook's Lane before the Ford rose. Not a woman. "I am Iris Latham," she said. The initial was my father's habit of signing letters, not a disguise. "I have his letter of recommendation, the bishop's certificate, and my own hand, which you may compare to the one on the schoolhouse ledger, since I understand it was your last master's custom to keep his sums in it." She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that raising one's voice was a thing poor women did when they had nothing else, and she had, if little else, her father's training, which was worth more to her most mornings than money. Corbett opened his mouth to argue, and then, because arguing required looking at the ledger he had brought to prove some point about wages, opened the ledger instead. Iris glanced at the column of figures upside down in the rain, added them in her head before he had finished wetting his thumb to turn the page, and said, mildly, "You have carried a 4 as a 1 in the 3rd line. The parish owes £11 too, not 8. There was a silence in which the rain seemed to get louder. Behind the low stone wall of the schoolyard, 6 village children had gathered to watch, undeterred by weather, the way children are undeterred by weather when something more interesting than weather is happening. Among them, a thin, dark-haired boy of perhaps 9 stood very still at the fence, not calling out with the others, only watching her with an attention so complete it looked, for a moment, like recognition, though of what? Neither of them could have said. Neither would have guessed, standing in that rain, that the quiet weighing of that boy's eyes on a stranger would end, within the year, by rearranging the succession of a dukedom that none of them had any reason yet to think of at all. Corbett handed over the key. It was cold, and larger than it needed to be, the kind of key that had been made for a door built when doors mattered more than the rooms behind them. The schoolhouse itself, once she was inside and had lit a fire in the small grate, told her plainly what sort of post she had taken. The roll book had not been touched properly in 11 months. The previous master, an elderly man named Hobbs, had died owing himself more attention than the parish had paid him, and the register of admissions was a ruin of crossed-out names and children who had grown and left and been readmitted under wrong ages. She sat down at the schoolmaster's desk, which had clearly been built for a heavier man, and began, by candlelight, because the rain had not let up enough to trust the window, to put names back into order. It was, she thought, the only thing she had ever been reliably good at. Her father, Silas Latham, had kept the register of a parish 2 counties distant for 30 years before his eyes failed him, and in the last 2 years of his life, when he could no longer read his own hand without a glass. He had taught her everything he knew instead of losing it, how paper carried the year of its own making in the lines pressed into it long before anyone set a word down, how ink darkened and lightened by decade and by maker, how a man's hand changed under strain in ways he never noticed and never could correct, so that a false signature always confessed itself to a patient enough eye. He had left her his loop, a small brass cased watchmaker's glass, and a slim commonplace book in which he had recorded the marks of every papermaker and every parish clerk's ink he had ever had occasion to examine. It was, she often thought, a strange inheritance for an unmarried woman with no property and no expectations. It had also, twice now, cost her a post, the last time in a village 3 days' journey east, where a jealous patroness had accused her of altering the poor rate accounts to hide her own economies, and no one had believed the schoolmistress over the squire's wife. Evidence or no evidence. She had left owed 6 weeks' wages she had never collected, on principle, because she would not beg for what was rightfully hers, and would not be shamed into forgetting it either. A name is not proof, her father used to say, folding his glass shut. A name is only a question, and a good clerk learns to answer it. She had come to Millbrook meaning to ask no questions of anyone, and to answer only the ones the roll-book put to her. She did not yet know that Millbrook's greatest house had a question of its own, 11 years old, locked behind shutters that had not been opened since a man went missing at sea. She was summoned to Rosemere Hall on her 4th day, not by invitation, but by the plain fact that the school's funding, and her wage, were the Duke's to grant, and no clerk in the county would release a shilling of it without his Grace's man confirming the new appointment. She walked the 1.5 miles up the drive on a morning gone fine after the storm, past an avenue of limes gone shaggy for want of trimming, and arrived at a house that struck her, before she had set foot on its steps, as a house holding its breath. Half its windows were shuttered in full daylight. No dog barked. A gardener working alone at a hedge did not look up as she passed, and when she asked him for the door, he pointed rather than spoke, as though the hall had trained him out of using his voice on its grounds. She was received not by the Duke's steward, whom she had expected, but by the Duke himself in a study with the curtains half drawn, a fire built too small for the size of the room. Aldric Fenwick, Duke of Rosemere, was younger than she had pictured, perhaps 34, and leaner than a duke in a story ought to be, with the particular stillness of a man who has trained himself not to react to things, and a stick set against his chair that he did not use to rise, because he did not rise at all. He did not apologize for it. He merely watched her the way she imagined he watched most new things arrive on his land, as a fact to be assessed, not a person to be charmed. "You are younger than the last one," he said. "He was 70, Your Grace. Most people are younger than that." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and did not stay long enough to be measured. "Corbett tells me you corrected his sums in the rain." "I did." "Was he angry?" "He was wet. I believe the two together made it difficult for him to be as angry as he wished." The stick, she noticed, had not moved, neither had his hand, resting flat on a ledger she suspected he had not opened in some weeks. "State your terms," he said. "I am told schoolmasters generally have some." She had thought about this on the walk-up, in the way she thought about everything that touched money, carefully, and without shame. "I will take the wage advertised. I will not take it, however, until Mr. Hobbs's widow has been paid what was owing to him at his death. I understand it is £11 too, not 8. And I understand it has been 6 months unpaid. That is not your debt to collect." "No," she agreed. "It is yours, your Grace." "I only decline to be paid ahead of a woman who is owed first." She did not look away from him as she said it, which she suspected surprised him more than the sum did. He studied her for a moment that went on slightly too long to be comfortable, and then said, "You will have it," in a voice with no warmth in it, and, she thought, no coldness either, only the flat exactness of a man settling an account because it was correct to settle it, not because anyone had moved him to. It was, she would come to learn, the only kind of kindness Rosemere Hall currently dealt in, kindness paid like a debt, never spoken like a gift. As she rose to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, the words falling out of him, the way facts fall out of a man too tired to dress them up as conversation. The charity inspector comes in the autumn. He will want the children's baptisms proved against the parish register before he'll certify the school for its grant. The old rector's hand had gone by the end, and I am told the register from those years is not what it should be. He looked, briefly, at the shuttered window rather than at her. You may find that tedious work. I find disordered records restful, Your Grace, she said. They are the only kind of trouble that always resolves, if one is patient. She did not know, walking back down the shaggy lime avenue with the wage settled and Mrs. Hobbs's debt promised, that she had just accepted, without knowing it, the one piece of work in all of Millbrook capable of unmaking everything the house was pretending not to remember. Millbrook took a fortnight to decide what it thought of her, and decided in the way villages do, through wagers rather than conversation. Mrs. Aldous at the shop gave her 3 weeks before the men ran her off. The smith's boy gave her till Michaelmas out of what he called simple politeness. Reverend Elias Thorne, the rector, gave his opinion in person, arriving at the schoolhouse unannounced on a Tuesday to observe her teach, arms folded through the whole lesson, like a man watching a horse he suspected of being lame. What he watched was this: a boy named Simmons produce, with wide innocent eyes, a note purporting to excuse his absence the previous day, signed by his mother. Iris took the note, held it a moment under the window light, and said, without any particular drama, your mother writes on the shop's wrapping paper, when she writes at all, Simmons. Because that is what is in the house. This is drawing paper, and rather good drawing paper, of the kind kept in the vicarage schoolroom cupboard. I expect you'll want to put it back before the Reverend notices it's missing. The boy went the colour of a boiled ham. The other children laughed, not unkindly, and Simmons owned to a day spent fishing rather than a day spent ill, and was set to copy verses rather than caned, which was itself a small scandal in a village accustomed to canes. Thorne, unfolding his arms slightly, said afterward, "You read paper the way other people read faces." My father taught me to. He said faces lie more easily than paper does, because paper cannot help remembering exactly when and where it was made, an odd thing for a schoolmaster to know, an odd thing for anyone to know, I imagine, until the day it is useful. She did not tell him the rest of it, that her father had died believing the skill had ruined more for her than it had ever saved. Thorne did not ask. But he watched her a moment longer than the lesson required, in the particular way of a man filing a fact away, without yet knowing what drawer it belonged in. It was Edgar Marlowe, the Duke's cousin, and the man who managed the estate's accounts in his Grace's long withdrawal from such things, who came to welcome her more loudly than anyone else had bothered to. He arrived at the schoolhouse on a fine afternoon with a basket of oranges with his Grace's compliments, though Iris noted, and did not remark upon, that his Grace had said nothing to her of oranges. Marlowe was handsome in the well-fed way of a man who had never gone hungry, and had convinced himself this was a virtue rather than a fact, and he complimented her twice on her composure with the churchwardens before she had told the story to anyone but the Duke. "Word travels in a small place," he said, smiling. When she asked how he'd heard it, "You'll find Millbrook keeps no secrets at all, Miss Latham. Nothing here is hidden for long." He said it warmly, the way a man says a pleasant thing he has decided in advance to say, and his eyes went, for one unguarded half-second, past her shoulder to where the collier boy sat copying his letters with a hand steadier and finer than any 9-year-old's had business being. "The miller's boy does well," Marlowe said in a different voice, quieter, as though noting it for a ledger rather than a compliment. "The colliers keep to themselves. Best left be, I always think. Some families do better without the county taking an interest." Iris said nothing to that, because she had as yet no reason to say anything at all. She only remembered it the way she remembered every out-of-place stroke of a pen, filed, not yet read. The estate's damaged papers came to her by way of a compromise neither of them had quite intended to make binding. Aldrich had a room of his late father's correspondence and account books, water stained after a bad winter roof that no one at Rosemere trusted themselves to sort. He offered her the work on the same flat, debt-settling terms he offered everything, a fair sum, paid promptly, no talk of favour. They worked in the same room some afternoons, an arrangement that began as convenience and became, without either of them naming it, a kind of company. He read, she catalogued, the silences between them lengthened and grew easier rather than harder, which she had not expected of a man reputed through 3 villages to be cold. It was in one of those silences, dust thick on both their hands, that Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, grey and upright and much older than her quick step suggested, set down a tray of tea, and, seeing the pile of Nathaniel Fenwick's boyhood letters Iris had just uncovered, went very still in the doorway before recovering herself and leaving without a word. "You'll forgive her," Aldrich said, not looking up from the ledger in his lap. "My brother's name still does that to this house, 11 years on." He turned, she noticed, a ring on his little finger. A plain gold band worked with an anchor crossed over a sheaf of wheat, a habit she had seen twice before without remarking on it, always when something had cost him more than he wished to show. "Nathaniel went to sea against my father's wishes, married against them again in secret, we think, though no one could ever prove it, and was lost off the Azores 3 years later, without either of us having spoken a civil word to him in between. I have spent 11 years wishing I had written one letter. I did not know, until it was no longer possible, that I had been waiting for him to write first. That is not a small grief to carry alone," Iris said. "No," he agreed. "It is, I find, exactly the size of a house." He looked at her then, briefly, with something that was not quite invitation and not quite request, and changed the subject before either of them had to decide what to do with it. She told him, in turn, of her father, his failing eyes, his patient hands teaching hers what his could no longer manage alone, his death in a rented room with his commonplace book on the coverlet, and his last words a correction of her spelling. She did not tell him of the accusation that had followed, not yet, though she came close one evening at the vicarage, where Thorne's spinster sister had assembled half the parish's respectable women to inspect the new schoolmaster over seed cake. Marlowe's own sister, a Mrs. Iddesleigh, asked with a smile sharpened to a fine point whether it wasn't rather forward for a woman to hold a post-styled master, and whether Miss Latham didn't find it strange to sit where men had always sat. Iris answered that she found the chair no stranger than any other chair, being made of the same wood, and that she had yet to meet a ledger that cared which hand balanced it, and the room laughed in the wrong direction for Mrs. Iddesleigh's liking, and the subject was allowed, grudgingly, to die. It was 2 days later, sorting a bundle of Nathaniel's old sea-chest papers gone soft with damp, that she found a torn half-page in an unfamiliar hand, the ink faded to rust brown, bearing only the letters NF. And, beneath them, the single word Millbrook, and what looked like the beginning of a direction to a mill. She set it aside to ask Aldrich about, and then did not, because Marlowe arrived unannounced to discuss the quarter's accounts, and the moment closed over the scrap, the way water closes over a dropped stone, without anyone above the surface, yet aware that anything had gone in. The county's charity inspector was to come at Michaelmas, and it was in preparing for him, cross-checking every child on her roll against the parish's baptismal register, kept in Thorne's vestry in a chest whose key, she noted with a small private smile, was nearly the twin of the schoolhouse key Corbett had so nearly refused her, that Iris found the entry that would end the quiet of Rosemere Hall for good. It was recorded 9 years back, in a hand she did not recognise as belonging to either Thorne or his predecessor at that date, a fact her eye caught before her mind had finished reading the words themselves. Thomas, son of Nathaniel Fenwick, mariner of Rosemere, and Grace his wife. Baptised the 11th day. She read it 3 times. She knew the name Fenwick as every soul in Millbrook knew it, the way villagers know the name of whatever house feeds them. She had not, until that moment, thought to wonder whether the miller's foster son, quiet and quick and better with a pen than any boy his age had business being, carried it as more than a common coincidence. She looked at the hand again, too careful, too evenly spaced, unlike the hurried ink-blotted entries around it, and felt the particular cold certainty her father used to call the clerk's chill, the sense before proof of a fact about to become unavoidable. She did not tell Thorne that day. She told no one. She walked to Rosemere Hall in the last of the daylight, was shown in by a startled Mrs. Pruitt, and found Aldrich in his study with the fire built, for once to its proper size. "You look as though you've walked further than 1.5 miles, he said, before she had spoken a word. "I have found something in the parish register, Your Grace, that I believe concerns your family more nearly than the school." She set the copied entry on the desk before him, her hand steadier than her heart. "I would not have brought it to you if I were not certain of the reading. I have read a great many registers. I have never seen a hand change so plainly in the middle of a single year's page, nor a name sit so exactly where it should not." He read it once. She watched the stillness that had never once broken in her presence break entirely. His hand, the one that wore the anchor and wheat ring, going flat and white-knuckled against the desk, his breath catching audibly enough that Mrs. Pruitt, passing in the hall, stopped where she stood and did not come in. "Where?" he said, and the word came out with no voice left in it at all. "Did you find this?" "In your own parish register, Your Grace. 9 years recorded. A boy of that age, and that name, lives not a mile from this house, at the collier's mill." He did not speak again for a long moment. When he did, it was very quietly, and not entirely to her. Nathaniel married her. He actually married her. He looked up, and whatever composure had governed his face for 11 years was, for the length of one unguarded breath, entirely gone. "Tell no one of this. Not Thorne, not Marlowe, not the churchwardens, no one, until I know what it is I am holding. I have been made a fool of gently for 11 years, Miss Latham. I find I would rather not be made a fool of loudly before I understand why." She agreed, and left him there, with the entry in his hand, and the fire finally warming the whole room. She did not see, from the drive, the figure of Edgar Marlowe drawing back from an upstairs window he had no particular business standing at, nor did she know, walking home in the dark with her father's warning humming quietly in her blood, "A name is not proof, only a question, that the page she had shown the Duke that evening had, once before, been shown to another man entirely, and that the answer he had given it, 9 years past, had been to make sure no one would ever be able to ask the question again. The blow came within the week, and it came, as her father had always warned her such blows came, dressed as procedure. Thorne's under-clerk, a nervous, narrow man named Wick, who kept the vestry chest when the rector's gout kept him from his own church, appeared at the schoolhouse on a Thursday morning, with 2 churchwardens and a face like a man walking to his own hanging. Though it was Iris he had come to accuse. "There is a discrepancy," Wick said, not meeting her eye, "in the parish register. An entry appears to have been altered in a hand," he added, forcing the words out, "not unlike your own, Miss Latham." "I have never held a pen to that register," she said. "I copied an entry. I did not write one." "That is not what the ink suggests," said Corbett, unhappily, holding a leaf of paper she had never seen before, a leaf claiming, in a hand that did resemble a stiffened, disguised version of her own, to record the very entry she had shown Aldrich, save that this version made no mention of Rosemere at all, and bore, folded within it, a scrap of her own schoolroom paper, as though it had been used as a guide. It was found this morning, tucked where the true page should be. The Reverend is greatly distressed. Mr. Marlowe says he stopped, unhappy at his own sentence, and finished it anyway. Mr. Marlowe says a woman clever enough to read old paper might be clever enough to forge new paper. If she thought a lonely widow's boy might be made to look like a duke's kin, and a reward found in it somewhere, she understood, with a coldness that steadied rather than frightened her, exactly what had been done and by whom, though she could not yet prove either. "I did not write that page," she said again, plainly, without raising her voice, because raising her voice was what a guilty woman did, and she would not give them that. "But I will find who did, and I will show you how, and you will not enjoy learning how simple it was." She was suspended from the school that same afternoon, pending the bishop's officer's inquiry, and Millbrook, which had taken a fortnight to decide it liked her, took less than a day to decide it had never trusted her at all. A stone went through the schoolhouse window that night, more insult than injury, and by Sunday even Mrs. Aldous at the shop would not meet her eye across the counter. Worse followed within days. Word came from the mill that the collier's lease, quietly and without explanation, was to be reviewed at quarter day, and that the boy Thomas, bright, quick, altogether too noticeable now that eyes had turned that way, was to be sent to a charity apprenticeship 2 counties off before he got notions above a miller's foster son, a decision that had somehow originated with the estate's own steward, and that no one, least of all Hannah Collier weeping over her mending, could say how to refuse. Iris did not wait to be told twice what needed doing. The diocesan registry at Cardwell held, she knew, a fair copy of every year's parish entries, sent up each Michaelmas by law, and never touched again, a copy no local hand could quietly amend 11 years after the fact. It was 18 miles distant, and the ford at Redlow was running high with a week of storm water when she set out on foot before dawn, having no coin left for a hired cart, and no wish to ask Rosemere for one. She crossed the ford with the water at her waist, and her father's commonplace book wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, and arrived at Cardwell so drenched and shaking that the registrar's clerk tried twice to send her away, before she could make him understand what she needed. She left with the copy in hand and a fever coming on by the time she reached the ford again, and crossed it a second time, because there was no other way home, and it cost her 4 days in a vicarage sickbed and a cough that lingered a fortnight after. A price she paid without regret, because the copy she carried said, in plain unaltered ink, 9 years old. Exactly what the Rosemere Register had once said before someone had decided it should say something smaller. She woke on the 2nd day of her fever to find Reverend Thorne's sister spooning broth into her, and the rector himself sitting stiffly by the window, turning his hat in his hands like a man who had come to apologise, and had not yet found the courage. "Wick has been to see me," he said, once she was awake enough to hold a spoon herself. "Guilt does not sit well on a narrow conscience, Miss Latham. He has told me he was paid, 9 years past, to recopy a leaf of the register after water got at it. Recopy it a little differently than the original, on Mr. Marlowe's particular instruction, though he swears he was told at the time it was only tidying a smudge. He was paid again a fortnight ago to produce a second leaf, made to resemble your hand, and to say he'd found it where the truth should be." Thorne's jaw worked. "I have kept that register 30 years. I did not see what a woman half my age saw inside a fortnight. I have been sitting here deciding whether that shames me more than it should convince me, and I find it does neither. It only convinces me. Then you'll stand for me before the bishop's officer. I will stand for you before God himself if it comes to that," he said, gruffly, and looked, for the rest of the visit, entirely too moved by his own sentence to say anything further of substance. It was Mrs. Pruitt who came the following evening, once Iris was well enough to sit up, with a small locked box she set on the coverlet, as though it burned her hands to hold it. "I should have spoken 11 years ago," she said, "and I did not, because Mr. Marlowe was master of this house's correspondence by then, his Grace being too sunk in grief to open his own letters, and Mr. Marlowe told me the woman who wrote asking, after Captain Fenwick was some adventuress, with a claim to invent, and I believed him, because it was easier than not believing him. I kept only what fell loose from the packet before he took it, a wax seal, broken, and this." She opened the box. Inside lay a small gold ring, worked with an anchor crossed over a sheaf of wheat, identical in every line to the one Aldrich wore on his own hand. "Mrs. Collier has its twin's letter cousin, the other half of a pair cut for 2 brothers, so neither would forget the other was the other half of a whole. Or so the old Duke used to say of them as boys. She has kept it 11 years for a day she never thought would come." Iris held the ring a long moment, feeling its weight, understanding without being told that she was holding, in one small circle of gold, the entire architecture of what her father's training had only pointed toward. "Then we have the letters fellow, the registers fellow, and the rings fellow," she said. 3 things Mr. Marlowe never thought would be asked to stand in the same room together. It was Aldrich himself who came last, after dark. Having ridden through weather no duke needed to ride through for a schoolmistress's sick-bed, and sat by her without speaking for some minutes before he said, "Lo, I have spent 11 years grieving a brother I now find I might have written to, and a nephew I might have known for 9 of his 9 years, and I have you to thank for both griefs arriving at once, which I did not expect gratitude to feel so much like mourning." He took her hand, chastely, only that, his thumb tracing once over her knuckles, as though checking she were real, and said, "Whatever comes of the assembly, whatever Marlowe manages to twist before Thursday, I find I do not wish this house to go back to being quiet. I had grown used to it. I no longer want it." He did not say more than that, and did not need to. She understood it for the confession it was. What she did not say aloud, holding his hand back, was the question that kept her from sleeping that night, whether the ring, the letter, and the register's true copy would be enough, gathered in time, to stop Edgar Marlowe from being read into the county's deed books as heir, before Thomas ever had the chance to be read into anything at all. The Harvest Assembly at Rosemere Hall had been held every Michaelmas for longer than anyone living could say otherwise, and this year it was to close, after the dancing, with the county solicitor, Mr. Pettigrew, reading the settlement that named Edgar Marlowe heir presumptive to a dukedom its own duke had, by every appearance, given up hope of settling any other way. The ballroom was full, 200 guests by Mrs. Pruitt's careful count, every family within 11 miles represented, the fiddles still going in the gallery when Thorne walked the length of the room with Iris on one side and Hannah Collier, white-faced and gripping her nephew's hand, on the other. Marlowe saw them before Aldrich rose to meet them, and something in his face closed like a shutter drawn against weather. "This is not the place," he said, pitched low, though not low enough. A dozen heads had already turned. "It is exactly the place," Aldrich said, "since it is the place you chose for Mr. Pettigrew to name you my heir. I find I would rather the same room here, why he should not." What followed took the better part of an hour, and no one in that ballroom, not even the Dowager Lady Sowerby, who had seen 40 Michaelmas assemblies and considered herself unshockable, moved to leave before its end. Thorne spoke first, plainly of the register, and of Wick's confession, delivered now in writing and read aloud by Pettigrew himself, who had no love of scandal, but less love of signing his name to a fraud. Iris produced the Cardwell copy, and, under lamplight brought close enough for Lady Sowerby herself to lean in and squint, laid her father's loop over the disputed leaf beside a sample from the parish's own paper stock of that same year, showing plainly, to anyone with patience to look, that the leaf blamed on her bore a maker's watermark not milled until 3 years after the date inked upon it, a page that could not possibly be 9 years old, however carefully it had been aged with tea and smoke to look it. "Paper," she said, into a room gone very quiet, remembers the year of its own making long before any hand sets a word upon it. This page remembers being made after I ever set foot in Millbrook. Marlowe laughed, once, badly, a schoolmistress's parlour trick. "You knew the leaf's date before I named it," Aldrich said, quietly, and the room's quiet sharpened into something else entirely. "I did not say when it was made. Only Miss Latham did, and only after she'd shown the watermark. How is it you knew what to object to before she'd finished speaking?" Marlowe said nothing, and his silence said everything a courtroom could have asked of him. Mrs. Pruitt stepped forward then, with the small ring in her open palm, and Hannah Collier, weeping now without trying to hide it, drew its twin's own broken seal from her apron and laid it beside it. And Aldrich drew the ring from his own finger and set it against them both, 3 pieces of one whole cut, for 2 boys grown into 2 men who had never learned, until it was nearly too late, that they had never stopped being halves of the same thing. Thorne spoke last, and loudest, in the voice he used for sermons that mattered. "I have kept that register 30 years, and did not see what this young woman saw inside a fortnight of arriving among us. I doubted her because she was young, and because she was a woman holding a man's old post. And I was wrong to doubt her on either count, and I say so now, before all of you, because a shepherd who will not own his own blindness is no shepherd at all." He turned, deliberately, to face the room rather than the Duke. "I believe every word of it. I would stake my collar on it." The room turned the way a tide turns, not all at once, but entirely, once it starts. Lady Sowerby was the first to say, aloud and to no one in particular, that she had always thought Marlowe a shade too warm to be trusted, and by the time Pettigrew cleared his throat to ask what the Duke wished done, the matter had already, in every way that counted, been decided by 200 witnesses rather than by him. Aldrich did not have Marlowe arrested. "You will quit this county within the month," he said, "and you will not be prosecuted for it, though God knows the law would allow it, because I find I would rather my nephew grow up in a county that does not remember his father's name attached to a trial." Marlowe's hands, Iris noticed, were shaking badly enough that he had to press them flat against his own coat to still them, and when he spoke again it was not in the warm performing voice he had used for 11 years, but in something smaller and older. "I was passed over for this house once, as a boy, and told to be grateful for what I was given instead," he said. "I have spent every year since making certain I was never passed over again. I did not hate the boy. I want it said I did not hate the boy," he asked, before he was led out, so quietly that only Iris and Aldrich were close enough to hear it, whether anyone would ever tell Thomas that his father and mother had truly loved each other, married lines and all, and not simply been two unlucky people who had made him by accident. Aldrich said that they would. It was the only mercy Marlowe was given that night, and, Iris thought, watching his face, perhaps the only one he had actually wanted. The county did not wait long to settle what an evening's revelation had unsettled. Within the fortnight, Pettigrew's clerks had struck Marlowe's name from every paper it had ever touched, and entered another in its place. Thomas Fenwick, son of the late Captain Nathaniel Fenwick, and Grace his lawful wife, acknowledged nephew to his Grace the Duke of Rosemere, and, failing further issue, his heir. The boy took the news the way children take most enormous news, which is sideways, asking first whether he would still be permitted to fish the mill race, and only much later, lying awake, asking Hannah whether it meant he could not love her any more for being only his aunt and not his mother. She told him it meant no such thing at all, and he seemed, after some days of turning it over, the way he turned over any hard sum, to accept that a boy could hold two truths in one chest without either one crowding out the other. The Colliers were given, at Aldrich's insistence and over Peter Collier's stubborn protest that they wanted no charity, a freehold on the mill they had rented 11 years, and Hannah a standing place in the boy's life that no document could improve upon, and none was asked to. Wick was dismissed from the vestry without prosecution, on Thorne's plea that a frightened man led astray young by a stronger man's coin deserved a second trade in a second county rather than a cell. He took a clerk's place with a cousin in Cardwell, and was not, so far as Millbrook ever heard from with complaint again. For Iris, there was a summons to the hall she had by now learned to read correctly, and a room she had not seen before, a disused wing, damp-stained and shuttered like the rest, which Aldrich led her into with a lamp and an unaccustomed nervousness, sitting oddly on so still a man. "I mean to found a school here," he said, larger than the parish one. "Open to every child in 3 villages, regardless of what their fathers can pay, and I would have it kept by whoever can be trusted to read a register better than anyone else living, and to teach a room full of children that a name is a question worth asking honestly, rather than a wall to keep questions out. I can think of only one person for the post." He hesitated, in the manner of a man who had rehearsed a sentence, and found, at the moment of speaking it, that the rehearsed version would not do. "I would call it the Latham School, for your father, if you'll allow it. And I would ask you to stay at Rosemere altogether, not because you found what was buried here, and not out of any debt I owe you for it, that debt I mean to settle separately, and in full, the way I settle every debt, but because the house has been better since you came into it, and I have found I no longer wish to know what it was like before. That is either a proposal or a very long employment offer, Your Grace, she said, though her voice was not as steady as she meant it to be. It is both, if you'll have it be. I am told a duke ought to manage a cleverer sentence than that, but you have spent some weeks now teaching this county that plain sentences hold up better than clever ones. He took her hand again, as he had by her sick-bed, and this time did not let it go, and touched his forehead to hers, once, lightly, the whole gesture no longer than a held breath, the first and only heat either of them permitted the moment, and enough, entirely, for both of them. "Stay because you wish it," he said. "No other reason will hold, and I find I do not want one that would." She said yes, in the end, in words far plainer than the question had deserved, and it was enough. By the following Michaelmas, the shuttered wing of Rosemere Hall had windows thrown open on every fine day, and the sound coming through them most mornings was not silence, but 40 children reciting sums badly and cheerfully in a room that had once held nothing but damp ledgers, and a grief no one would name aloud. Thomas Fenwick, styled now with the small courtesy his uncle had insisted on, and wearing it as awkwardly as any 9-year-old wears a new coat, sat in the front row not because he was heir to anything, but because he liked, best of all his lessons, the hour Iris still kept for register work, tracing old hands across old pages with a magnifying glass his own size, learning. As his grandfather in trade, Silas Latham, had once taught a frightened orphaned girl, that paper never lies about the year of its own making, however hard a dishonest hand tries to make it. Thorne married Iris and Aldrich himself that spring, in a church whose register he now checked twice a year on principle, and preached, at the wedding breakfast, a sermon so short and so unlike him that his own sister accused him of having been possessed by a more sensible man. Mrs. Pruitt lived to see the nursery used again, on Thomas's account first, and within 2 years on another's, and considered it, she said often, the finest debt life had ever paid her for keeping a secret box 11 years too long. Of Edgar Marlowe, Millbrook heard only once more, some years on, a small unsigned book of ships and rigging arriving each year on the boy's birthday from a tutoring post 2 counties off, which Thomas kept on his shelf without ever quite being told, until he was old enough to guess it himself, exactly who had sent it. On the morning of the first Latham School's opening, Iris stood again at the same schoolhouse door where Corbett had once held a key against his chest and refused to give it to her. The key hung now on a plain iron hook beside the frame, unfought over, unremarkable, the door standing open to weather gone fine, and children spilling through it laughing, Thomas among them, Aldrich beside her, leaning less on his stick than he once had, for reasons neither of them examined too closely, and both privately credited to the same cause. She thought, watching the light run the length of a floor that had once been dark enough to teach by candle at noon, of her father folding his glass shut over some correctly settled question, and of the sentence he had left her, worn smooth now from a year of teaching it to other people's children. A name is not proof. It is only a question, honestly asked, that the truth was always patient enough to answer, however long it was made to wait.